The field of mental health counseling is growing rapidly, and Richmont Graduate University can equip you with everything you need as a licensed professional counselor while integrating your faith into your clinical practice. Programs are offered in Atlanta, Chattanooga, and online. Apply today at richmont.edu. That's richmont.edu.
I'm Earlonne Woods.
I'm Nigel Poor. We're the hosts and creators of Ear Hustle from PRX's Radiotopia.
Ear Hustle is a show about life inside prison, but it's not your typical prison podcast.
In this next season, we've got stories about the objects people keep inside their prison cells,
about residents in a women's prison who say they want to stay there,
and the most beautiful prison garden. Earlonne, I will never forget it.
Ear Hustle. Stories about life on the inside, told by those who live it.
Find Ear Hustle wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome to another week, a new week, and a new edition of Political Breakfast. We are always so glad to have you here listening on WABE. Republican strategist Brian Robinson is here today. Tharon is off for a once-in-a-lifetime event. He took his son to the White House for the annual Easter egg hunt, which I think is pretty cool. But in for Tharon is Saba Long, and it's always good to see Saba and have Saba is the executive director of the Atlanta Civic Circle. And Lily Oppenheimer with her Easter egg nails, our producer, is also here today. So welcome all of you. Good to see you.
Good morning.
Good morning, everyone.
Yeah, everybody's smiling. We were quickly chatting about how beautiful the weekend was.
Saturday was that perfect temperature where you could be outside with the kids for an egg hunt. And it wasn't too cold. It wasn't too hot. It was just a perfect day. And I'll say, I hope Tharon has a great time at the egg roll. Quinn got to go 2 years during the previous administration.
It's an Easter egg hunt. It is an egg roll, right?
It's a
for
roll.
Sure.
Yeah, it's a roll.
Yeah.
And they hand out a lot of boiled eggs. I learned brilliance putting them on a stick and dipping them in like honey mustard sauce there.
What?
So I use that. Yeah, isn't that great? Oh, it's fantastic. They have ranch. It's great. Check it out. That's how I eat my boiled eggs now. I learned this at the White House.
Yes, Saba, I'm with you. We're shaking our. No, doesn't sound too appetizing.
Yeah, you're missing out.
By the way, have y'all ever heard of people getting money as part of the Easter egg hunt? Have you heard of that? Like having cash in the eggs?
It has started in the neighborhood egg hunt. That has become a thing, yeah, which is ridiculous.
Stick a dollar bill in the egg?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. What was wrong with a little egg-shaped chocolate? That was a Peeps. I love
now we're paying kids to hunt.
Right. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Well, it was a nice, as you both mentioned, a nice relaxing weekend after the legislative session came to an end, came to a halt late Thursday night. And I know both of you were watching what was happening there, intensely. Saba, I want to begin with you because, we chatted earlier and, housing is a big issue for the Atlanta Civic Circle. And one bill in particular did make it over the hurdle, and it was House Bill 1182 that would have cut tax credits for building low-income housing. Again, it failed to cross the line. How closely were you watching that? How intense was that for you?
Yeah, that was one of a couple of housing bills that we were watching closely. And I think it's one that I'd say a lot of housing advocates were glad to see that it failed. The low-income housing tax credit is a program that for about 20 years now has provided a dollar-for-dollar match. So there's a federal credit for affordable housing development, and the state has a dollar-for-dollar match. And it would have cut it by 50%. Which at a time when we know housing affordability is a challenge across the state, it's not just a city issue, it's across the entire state, including in rural Georgia. That was a bill that I think a lot of housing advocates were glad to see that it did not pass.
Any thoughts from you, Brian, on that? I mean, because we've talked about housing a lot lately and the importance of our city in particular providing affordable housing, and that would have just kind of knocked it off the books, right?
My views on workforce housing tend to align pretty closely with those of Governor Kemp. At the beginning of the 2023 legislative session, he talked about workforce housing in one of those January speeches heading into the 23 legislative session. And he said, everybody celebrates the economic development wins. Everybody's high-fiving. But then when it comes to building homes for the new workers, there tends to be less enthusiasm. And he was saying then, I'm going to do something about it. These things have to go hand in hand. They have to be paired. And I tend to agree with him on that. This is good for our economy to have this construction going on. It's good for our tax base. And the low-income housing tax credit that Saba's talking about actually leads to really nice developments. These are not eyesores. This is not blight. These are people who go to work every day and they're able to come home and there's a development that's got manicured lawns, that's got washers and dryers inside the units, maybe even some crown molding. Oh my gosh. So these are some nice places for working Georgians to live, and those are good for the community. I think in some cases there is some NIMBYism. There is concern about what density of low-income workers might mean for local politics, could tilt the scales one way or the other. And look, that's part of politics. Let's not act like that's evil. It's always been considered. But in the big picture, we are growing rapidly. And if we want to have affordable homes for the middle class and even the upper classes, then we're going to have to keep building to keep up with the growth, because otherwise you're going to have happen what is happening here and across the country right now, a spiral of prices because demand outstrips supply. And that is a recipe for societal turmoil.
So, Saba, how frustrating was it for you, though, just to see House Bill 1182, one, get a hearing, and two, make it as far as it did?
Yeah, 1182 was, again, one of the bills that we were watching, and it's a reminder that this legislative session was one where oftentimes the will of the public was not heard, or the legislator was not acting in a posture of how do we lift up all Georgians in this session. At the end of the day, you want a state legislator that cares about, that enacts policies that help all Georgians. And housing affordability is one of those things. It's not just about low income, it's also about middle and even upper income. Mm-hmm. If you think about a middle income family and the fact that it's a challenge for them to find housing that they can afford, that they're dealing with folks who can come in and purchase what would have been an affordable house, but they're paying cash instead of having to go to the bank. That's something that's happening. You also have corporate landlords who are coming in and purchasing homes in bulk across the state. And so those are all things that middle income families also have to contend with. And so again, housing affordability is not just a low income Georgian challenge.
Expounding on that thought, though, that legislators did not necessarily address the will of the people, Brian, because you had mentioned that you saw an interesting dynamic this session, both in the House and the Senate, on how they treated various issues based on the fact that, elections, it is an election year.
I think we saw a stark difference in how both chambers of the General Assembly are approaching these issues. The House was very much approaching it from passing kitchen table issues that will help them win election and keep the majority in 2024, whereas the Senate, which has a more stable majority, it's going to be harder for Democrats to take the majority there on that side. Those guys were focused to some degree on creating issues to run on in 2026 when we are back to statewide elections, and presumably the lieutenant governor will run for governor and other senators will run for whatever opens up there, maybe Congress, maybe other statewide constitutional offices. If you look at what got passed, though, I would have to disagree with Saba that it's not things that matter to Georgians. I would say a lot of kitchen table stuff got addressed. There were raises for teachers and police officers. There was $1.5 billion put into the supplemental budget for transportation, in addition to the regular transportation funding in the big budget. There was funding for public schools. There was a resolution in the waiting days supporting IVF treatment in the wake of that Alabama controversy, showing that, hey, we are concerned about families in Georgia and we share your values on being able to start a family. These are some of the things that are at the forefront. There was, again, fully funded Hope scholarships. There was fully funded public schools. I know Democrats don't like it, but the move to give vouchers to families trapped in failing schools is a good step forward in empowering families and parents. And once those parents get that money, it's going to be really hard for Democrats to ever take it away because they're going to see the value of it as we move forward. And I'd like to see that program expanded in future years. So I would say that it's a win for Middle Georgia, not geographically Middle Georgia, the people who are politically in the middle in Georgia, but also for conservatives, because you had tax cuts, you had efforts to keep criminal illegal aliens in jail when they are arrested here, and they must cooperate with ICE in dealing with that. So I think there's a win for everybody, whether you're a conservative or whether you're an independent in this state.
Some of those, I think, were certainly wins for quote unquote middle Georgia. I think also at the same time, we had Medicaid again was not addressed. You also had a number of headlines come out, particularly in the last few days of session, that it almost read like we were the Florida state legislature, where there were these culture war type bills that were coming up for discussion that, again, ultimately were not important enough when there are other things that are more pressing, like expanding Medicaid. One thing I do want to give the legislator credit for was starting to address early childhood education in pre-K. There was salary parity, which was important for pre-K teachers, capping class sizes, and some significant investment. And that I do think is a win across the state for folks.
I absolutely agree on that. And one thing that we can work on for next year is, the sports betting didn't get a vote in the House. It passed the Senate. Of course, next year is a new biennial, so we start from scratch. The bills don't carry over. But, Ron Stevens, who's carrying the sports betting legislation in the House, was saying we've got a pathway there now. And that funding, which could be up to $150 million a year, right now is earmarked for expanded pre-K programs. And so that's going to be more classroom seats, but also hopefully higher pay for those teachers. It's very low pay, very hard to keep qualified teachers in those jobs. So we want to be able to address those things moving forward. And Saba brought up Medicaid expansion. Huge progress this year in the fact that there was a vote. This was the first time there'd ever been a vote. And it happened in the Senate, which is considered the more, MAGA body of the two. And it was tied. And it probably would have passed if Governor Kemp had not stepped in and said, I don't want to see this move forward. Of course, legislators aren't going to want to jump off a ledge if the governor's going to veto the legislation on the back end. But you're seeing Speaker Burns, who's got a great relationship with Governor Kemp, a relationship of trust, moving forward with a study committee this year on Medicaid expansion. He wants to see a private option like what they have in Arkansas, where the recipients, instead of being on Medicaid government insurance, they're on Medicaid private insurance done by private sector companies where the benefits are better. So that's a pathway that we're on now. We obviously are on the precipice of having the support in the Senate, which has been the bigger obstacle in the past. And so it's ironic that that's where the vote took place, because we always kind of thought this could pass the House if it was put on the floor there, but the Senate was more of an obstacle and uncertainty. And I think that 7-7 vote in committee shows that the votes in the Senate are there. And I think we got a hint that Lieutenant Governor Jones is okay with it, because that vote would not have happened if he had not been okay with it. And I think what happened there was Burt Jones courted the Democrats, courted Minority Leader Gloria Butler, and said, hey, I'm going to work with you on some stuff. We're going to give more money for HBCUs. We're going to get a new hospital at Morehouse School of Medicine, and I want your support on CON, which is hospital regulation reform. And Democrats did come to the table with him. And I think Burt Jones said, in return, you're going to get a vote on Medicaid expansion. And the Democrats almost got what they wanted. And again, we're seeing the pathway forward in the future. This is going to be a huge issue next year.
Support comes from the Grady Health Foundation, presenting Move for Grady Saturday, April 27th. When you ride, run, or walk for Grady, you help our entire community thrive. There's a distance for everyone, and all proceeds benefit Grady Health System. More at moveforgrady.com.
At a time when information continues to come at us faster and faster, sometimes you need to hit pause and rewind. NPR's Throughline takes you back in time to the source of the news stories filling your feed. Find NPR's Throughline wherever you get your podcasts.
And what about sports betting? And like I said, we hear about that year after year after year, and it got a little closer this year. I mean, were you surprised that legalizing sports betting did not cross the finish line this session?
I wouldn't say I was surprised. I mean, it is one of those things that every session, some form of betting seems to come up, which is, I always get a chuckle out of it considering we're in the Bible Belt.
It just won't go away, will it?
No, it's really the bros. I mean, I think the guys really want this to happen. We've been surveying residents across the state for our upcoming election coverage, and this is not an issue we've heard people clamor about.
Interesting.
Not to say that if it passes, folks won't bet. I think they absolutely will. But the issues that we keep hearing about are access to healthcare, affordability of healthcare, affordability of housing, climate, addressing the climate, which is something the state has not necessarily has done much of, reproductive rights, addressing polarization. I think those are the things that are really top of mind for folks right now.
Yeah, but education is top of mind for Georgia families, and expanded pre-K would be something that they would be interested in. So that's one way you have to look at sports betting as a way of providing education services. When the lottery was passed in the early 90s, it was a controversial issue then. And today it is sacrosanct. I mean, you would be murdered if you tried to do away with the lottery in Georgia, because people depend on pre-K and they depend on the Hope Scholarship and the Hope grants that have made technical colleges basically free here. So we're getting really close. I kind of disagree with the assessment that we've got to have a constitutional amendment. And we have some legal opinions from former jurists who agree that we don't need to have a constitutional amendment, because if you put it under the lottery, that's already in the Constitution. We don't need to legalize it separately. Now, there's this, obviously this year they decided that they needed to go that direction in the legislation coming out of the Senate. That makes the bar to get this 2/3 as opposed to 50+1, a huge, huge difference. So I do think we're getting closer to getting that passed. And it's not just that it's this $150 million that'll be coming into pre-K or whatever future General Assemblies decide to direct it to. It's also that we have sports betting right now. It's just not regulated. You can get around these things on your phone that block you from doing it because it's illegal in Georgia. You go to some offshore center and do it through that, or you fake it, make it look like you're in Tennessee or Florida where it's legal. So it's already happening. The only thing that's not happening is we're not getting tax revenue from it. So this is a way of providing protections for people who are playing. It's not going to make it more accessible than it already is. It's just going to make it better for taxpayers and for users. So I think that's a pretty strong argument going into 2025.
Immigration received a lot of attention going into this session. House Bill 1105, sweeping immigration bill that passed, requires local police to partner with Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE. Any real surprises there, particularly when you have immigrant rights advocates saying this will lead to racial profiling? Saba?
The death of Laken Riley, unfortunately, was immediately politicized. That's not me saying it. That's immigration activists saying it. That's Athens residents saying it. And it's a real challenge, right? I can understand the legislator wanting to address it. I don't know if this was the right approach. And it's not just me who has said that. Again, it's been law enforcement officials who have said this. Both police and sheriffs across the state have said there are some challenges with this bill. If I were a sheriff or a police officer, I would not want to unintentionally arrest an American citizen, right? And that is the question with this. And then the other thing is, how does this impact diverse communities across the state where their police and the sheriffs and law enforcement generally have built great relationships with immigrant communities? There is a risk that those relationships are fractured as a result of this legislation. And I think there's going to be a lot of work done to keep those relationships strong and to really build and rebuild trust given what's going on.
I disagree with the profiling approach to this, because the main thing that they did was address illegal aliens who have committed a crime. So they're not telling police, hey, go knock on doors just and ask for papers. This is someone got arrested for a violent crime, for a retail crime, for a murder, like what happened with Laken Riley. And of course, the suspect in the Laken Riley case is somebody who had a criminal history before this. And so that is where this could have been prevented rhetoric comes from. I don't see that as being overly political. I think this is one of those issues that kind of goes beyond the Republican base. I think the average person would be like, yeah, if you commit a crime and you're here illegally, the police should work with the federal authorities to get you out of the country after you are served the justice that is due you. So to me, this is just a reasonable reform. And there was also a look at sanctuary city policies. Athens had very publicly signaled that illegal immigrants were welcome in their community. They said, we're going to make sure you get the same services provided to a American citizen or to a foreigner living here legally. That is saying, hey, come here. We're rolling out the welcome mat. And the General Assembly is saying, stop doing that. We do not want to incentivize illegal immigration. And whatever the left thinks of that is where the middle of the electorate is.
I don't think the left would be saying, let's incentivize illegal immigration. I looked at some data right when this legislation was first introduced, and I want to say it came from, it was some university, but overwhelming majority, nearly 70% of folks who enter the country illegally are not, and who have had some interaction with law enforcement, they were not committing crimes. If there was a reason why they were arrested, it was for a misdemeanor, something like a tail light being out, something of that effect. So overwhelmingly, the majority of folks who are entering the United States are entering because they want a better life. They want access to a good paying job. They want to improve their family's condition. And I think that is ultimately what we have to remember in this conversation. Are there bad actors? Yes, there are bad actors in any type of community. And so I think we have to be really careful on the rhetoric when it comes to folks who've entered this country illegally and not paint everyone as a criminal, not paint everyone as a threat. Those are things that we just need to be really mindful of.
Yeah, I respectfully disagree. I appreciate Saba's approach here. I understand what she's saying, but I don't think the dividing line or what we have to keep in top of mind is that people are coming here seeking a better life. The bottom line is they are breaking American law, and we can have systems in place that incentivize breaking the law, or we can have a system in place that stops illegal immigration. And I think the Republican and Democratic parties' approach to that are starkly different. The rhetoric that Democrats have had about, quote unquote, the wall over the last 8 or 9 years shows a very different view on the root cause or the root problem when it comes to illegal immigration and trying to stop it. We do need to have barriers in place, and we've got a broken system. And I think that's the bottom line, is that people don't have a right. They don't have a right to come here for whatever their motives.
Ryan, I don't think most Dems are open. I don't think most Democrats are open border folks, right? I think ultimately, and really the challenge is that the federal government, both from the courts, both from ICE, from Homeland Security, have not done an adequate job of addressing the issue. And so it is now trickling down, so to speak, to folks at the local and state level. And that's the angst that you're seeing. And I hope that both the federal government really approaches this in a more urgent way, but they also communicate with folks on what they are doing. Because to Brian's point, I was listening to the mayor of New York City on the Breakfast Club last week, and this is one of the challenges that New York City's facing. We have to address it, right? I'm not saying come to America illegally. I don't think most folks are necessarily taking that posture, but we have to. When folks are here, we've got to figure out what to do, whether that's sending them back or having a pathway to legalization here, right? There are ways to approach this smartly from both parties, and we're not seeing that in a way that we need to.
Yeah, it needs to be approached gingerly because there's so many layers to this immigration issue. Saba Long is the executive director at Atlanta Civic Circle. She has managed and led digital and traditional communications and strategy for political campaigns, public and private sector projects all across the metro Atlanta area. Brian Robinson is a Republican strategist, communications consultant, and former deputy chief of staff for Governor Nathan Deal. Thanks to both of you hashing through everything. And we got one more episode coming up this week. We're going to talk about the former President Donald Trump coming to town again. So tune us in.
Hey y'all, I'm Mark Kendall.
And I'm David Perdue.
And we're the hosts of What's Good Atlanta, the new weekly comedy podcast from WABE.
On What's Good Atlanta, we run down uplifting and unusual headlines from the universe known as Atlanta.
And while we may not be journalists, we are comedians, and we'll be breaking down news and breaking down the stories that make you smile.
We're just trying to see what's good, Atlanta.
Episodes drop Fridays at WABE.org or wherever you get your podcasts. I get mine from a guy named Craig.
Shout out to Craig.
Mm-hmm.
WABE. From WABE Studios, the podcast where they read stories is a new children's storytelling podcast featuring notable Atlantans and performers reading classic and contemporary children's books. Each episode contains a story meant to entertain, inspire, and inform young listeners. No screens required. The podcast where they read stories features adaptations from both chapter books and picture books. Join us at WABE.org/stories podcast or wherever you listen to podcasts.
WABE.